Hi, folks. We want to offer a quick trigger warning. We want everybody to find what is useful here, but this is, in fact, a podcast about trauma. So please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself while you're listening to the Whole Again podcast. Thanks.
We're back. Thanks for joining us for our third episode of Whole Again, the podcast, the pod that helps the homies heal the homies, for survivors of trauma and those that love them, and the only pod where a couple of clinical trained social workers are telling you not to go to therapy, or at least don't go to therapy only and exclusively to deal with your trauma.
It ain't gonna do it all, folks.
And the podcast that states we all, without exception, can be whole again. I'm Teddy.
Hi, I'm Leslie.
Let's get into today's episode.
This episode 3, this statement 3 about trauma interrupts is kind of the messy middle of all of this. In this episode, more than our previous ones, we're going to spend some time on the harm side of the equation. And it can be a little destabilizing, right? So we just really encourage folks to do what they need to do to take care.
As a reminder, the framework is these following 5 statements. Number 1, we begin whole. Number 2, we embody trauma and healing across 5 domains. Number 3, that trauma interrupts. Number 4, that trauma overwhelms. And number 5, that we can be whole again. Today, we're digging into what we mean when we say that trauma interrupts. And that healing restores, though we will get into that more a little bit later. And in its simplest way, since we begin whole and embody trauma and healing across 5 layers or domains, we understand that trauma interrupts that wholeness, that wellness. And in fact, one of my favorite definitions of wellness is from Emily and Amelia Nagoski's book, Burnout. And the definition that they use is to be well is not to live in a state of perpetual safety and calm, but to move fluidly from a state of adversity, risk, adventure, or excitement back to safety and calm and out again. And for me, it's that fluidity that trauma interrupts. It gets us stuck in a place or makes it hard to come back home. We don't say that trauma breaks one's wholeness or wellness. In many ways, the discourse that we were handed is one in which that is what happens. As Leslie often says, we were essentially taught that trauma breaks your brain. And while we know that something that is broken can be made whole again, we don't want to overemphasize the brokenness.
Right. Our innate wellness or our innate wholeness, it might be compromised. It might be impacted. It might even be profoundly changed. But I reject the idea that it's broken. We are not the same after trauma, but we're not broken. You are not broken. Broken implies repair. And what trauma needs is integration and transformation. So this is why we use this word interrupts. And this is what we mean when we say trauma interrupts our safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. It breaks in. It gets in the way. In our training, we mostly got a sense of trauma by its symptomology, right, which we talked about some in the first couple of episodes. And this is a direct result of the influence of the DSM and kind of a Western medicalized diagnostic approach to trauma. It collects a bunch of symptoms and says, if you have these symptoms, you might have the PTSD, which means you probably experienced the trauma. And that can be a really useful way for clinicians to work their way back and kind of Sherlock Holmes their way to the root of a client's disorder in order to diagnose or treat it, because that's sort of the primary focus of that system. And additionally, in mainstream conversations about trauma, you typically hear different types of trauma described as either being acute, cumulative, complex, or chronic. And it's worth taking just a moment to define those so, we're getting kind of a full picture of how we talk about this. So acute is something that happens once with a high enough intensity that it overwhelms us. Cumulative is trauma that has like a slow drip, drip, drip. It happens repeatedly, usually over time. It may not be traumatic in and of itself, but the accumulation of that set of experiences is what is traumatic. Complex trauma is, we talked about layered or stacked traumas. So it's essentially different traumatic conditions or traumatic events that compound and disintegrate our overall sense of wellness. But it usually means multiple traumas that have kind of happened either concurrently or, over time. And then chronic trauma is persistent traumatic conditions that don't let up. So childhood abuse that happened multiple times over several years would be chronic trauma, or domestic violence that happens multiple times over several years would be considered chronic trauma. But y'all, we're not working in a clinical setting, and that is not, in fact, why we're doing this podcast. We want people to be able to identify and discern for themselves whether or not they have experienced something traumatic. We also want language that is more accessible and more descriptive, and honestly, like just kind of more narrative, if you will. We learn, we understand, we make meaning through story. So having descriptive narrative language can be like super helpful. So saying that trauma is an interruption is one way to do that. Have you experienced an interruption in your safety, agency, dignity, or belonging? If so, you may have experienced a traumatic event or conditions. And then to describe the types of interruptions, we also use a range of different words, including erosion, explosion, cleaving, or disintegration. And we do this because different traumatic experiences feel different. The sensations, thoughts, experiences, all of that accompany trauma, they have range and they have depth and they have texture. And so they're a felt sense oftentimes more than the way we're thinking about it, or just the thoughts or cognitions that we have around that particular traumatic experience or episode.
Yeah. So one of the things that for me really works around this framework of wholeness and wellness is that our wellness is kind of always seeking to be restored. It's always seeking to be whole again. And when trauma or persistent traumatic conditions interrupt that, yeah, it can take a lot of different forms and different shapes, right? So the slow erosion of one's dignity because of circumstances that are really far outside of their control. I think about the way that we have to survive capitalism, right? And many folks who are doing really undignified work in order to provide for themselves, provide shelter for their families. When I think about disintegration, right? So if my safety, agency, dignity, and belonging are intact, then when difficult things arise, my wholeness and wellness is more accessible. I'm more buffered, right? Like I can get back to it more quickly. And when those things become disintegrated, when they are not all together, then the circumstances or conditions that I'm exposed to are actually more traumatic, right? They are more likely to be traumatizing purely because my sense of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging is less intact. It's less integrated. I'm kind of less wholly protected. So those are some of the things that I think about when we, really put forward these concepts.
I think it just gives us a more nuanced way to talk about the experience, right? A lot of kind of mainstream cognitive behavioral therapies and other therapies really are about putting language to the traumatic experience or events. And I think that's helpful to a certain degree, but it also feels incomplete. So I think this is where being able to think about, yeah, that one was an erosion, or that one really felt like a cleaving. I would say the trauma of very suddenly losing my parents, not at the same time, but within 18 months of each other, both in completely sudden, kind of catastrophic ways, is a cleaving, right? It is a kind of trauma that had a very particular resonance to it that felt like a part of me was cleaved off. And that is different than the erosion of small microaggressions that kind of add up over time, or being told that, or my own internal judgment on, body image or something, like the negative eroding things I say to myself, because I am also existing in late stage capitalism and in an advertising model that seeks to make people feel terrible about themselves. So I think that having these different descriptions really helps us like put some form to it and understand that like a cleaving traumatic condition feels different than an explosion, right? Like, suddenly something out of the blue that just completely blows up your entire life, like has an explosion kind of quality to it. So these descriptive words, I think, can just help us integrate the experience into our bodies in order to get whole again. So there are some useful insights from clinical trauma research. One of the things that has been studied is scales of intensity and intrusion of traumatic events. So how intense was that interruption, or how intensely did that interruption happen? And then how intrusive is it to your everyday life? In diagnostic shorthand, we talk about something becoming a disorder when it is intrusive to your life. So flashbacks or nightmares or other sorts of trauma symptoms, how much do they interrupt your daily life is a sign of, how traumatic or how disordered, to use the clinical language, that is. But the question is, how insulated are we from the traumatic conditions that we've been moving and growing through? So if we have robust belonging and we have really firm safety, we have an internal sense of security, emotional, physical security, we may not feel the interruptions as intensely, and we may recover from them or return to wholeness more fluidly. By contrast, when we're exposed or overexposed to persistent traumatic conditions like poverty or chronic harm, then these interruptions become more intrusive and more intense.
Yeah, so when we're less protected, less insulated, it hits different, right? And this is one of the original statements of the framework. And as Leslie was saying earlier, we brought it in specifically because we needed a way to describe trauma in a way that was accessible and that really captured the prevalence of it, right? So part of the story of trauma, the clinical story of trauma, is that it's a rare human experience. And that's why it kind of has this kind of rarefied quality to it. Whereas what we're recognizing at this current moment is that while that might be true in the kind of history of human experience, it's definitely not true in our kind of modern contemporary experience. That these interruptions of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging are actually pretty common. And the way that people are surviving them are myriad. There's so many ways that people are trying to just kind of live their lives as uninterrupted as possible. And when we get criticisms or the occasional critique of the framework, this is where it usually shows up. They say, like, are you really saying that, like, capital T trauma is that common, right? If trauma is nothing more than an interruption of one of these four fundamentals of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging, aren't we minimizing it or watering it down? And the reality is our trauma response system and our stress response system are the same system. Like our body brain doesn't have a different system for, like, oh my God, did I send that email? Or, oh my God, that's a hippo chasing me, right? Like, it's the same system in our bodies. And so the way that we experience and metabolize or don't those kinds of traumatic conditions or those kinds of interruptions, like the way that they live in our body brain is the same, whether it's a capital T trauma or a lowercase t trauma. And so that's, for us, it's what makes the framework so useful for folks. Like it actually works at any of those scales. And we don't want to minimize the intensity with which people are surviving. Let's be clear, right? And we know that our bodies are brilliant and they're also simple. And we'll talk more about the body, brain, and the nervous system and kind of how it gets overwhelmed next episode. But just hold that part, right? That we are talking about, like, capital T trauma and also lowercase t trauma, and also all these kind of little stressors that are just running around in your life that are activating your stress response system in your body.
Okay, so I've spent some time talking about the forms that these interruptions can take and the kind of feel that they can have. So let's talk about those interruptions across the 5 layers. And a quick reminder, the 5 layers are individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and historical. And you'll remember from earlier episodes that we talked about these layers being kind of porous, right? So as we go through these examples, one of the things you might go is, whoa, that sounds kind of collective, or yes. We are herd animals. So even when we're describing trauma and healing at the individual level, it's still kind of a bit of a misnomer because so much trauma and healing is actually taking place interpersonally between people, right? Interpersonally, rather than intrapersonally, which means within ourselves. So most of our traumatic experiences happen in a context with witnesses, right? Either in the moment or after the fact. And that's part of sometimes what makes the experience traumatic in the first place.
Can I say something about the legal system real quick?
Please.
Cool. So, part of what we talk about is that there are system responses that are non-responsive to people's lived experiences, right? So the criminal legal system is a really great example that when someone experiences a criminalized harm, which could be, any range of, violence, that the criminal legal response tends to visit greater isolation onto that person and potentially like other kinds of violence to that person or to the person or to people that are near them or around them, right? And so when we think about folks who have survived some sort of violent act, if they go into the criminal legal system, one of the things that they're often required to do is to repeat the story of that harm, right? So they've got to tell it over and over and over again. They've got to tell it to the police. They've got to tell it to a lawyer. They got to tell it to the judge. They have to tell it in front of a bunch of other people, right? Who may or may not believe them. And in fact, because the system is adversarial, if they tell that story on the witness stand, someone is going to try to get them to recant their story while they're recounting it. And if you can imagine, for those of you who haven't had that experience, or for those of you who have, like what it feels like to have to tell the story of this moment of powerlessness, of hopelessness, of an incredible lack of safety, of an assault on your dignity or agency, and to have to tell it over and over and over again while people are waiting for you to mess up or trying to get you to be inconsistent in that story. And what we know about traumatic memory is that it actually doesn't work sequentially very well. And so the chances, the likelihood that you are going to recount that story chronologically in a way that would make sense in a courtroom is unbelievably low, right? And so from the moment of that violence, if you're accessing a criminal legal response to it, the likelihood that you're going to get what your kind of body brain, right, what your nervous system needs is really low inside of that system. What you'll get is actually less and less and less agency as you go further and further into that system.
Really one of the driving factors for me in developing this framework was my work working with young people who'd experienced sexual exploitation and trafficking. And since I've done that work since 2005, before that, what we just called youth who were involved in prostitution. And there was this specific moment where, when I was still doing direct service back in San Francisco, where I was in a courtroom with a 13-year-old young person who had been charged with the crime of prostitution, which fortunately we wouldn't probably do anymore, but in those days we still did. And here's this child, this young person standing in this courtroom, and all of these people around her who have so much more power than her, the judge, the prosecutor, and her own parent, are just talking about her in ways that were appalling, like out loud, on the record, calling her names and just talking about this kid's systemic abuse as if she were the only person responsible for it. When in my perspective, she was honestly the last person who was responsible for what was happening to her. The thing is that individual harm is almost never actually individual, right? Individual harm is always in a larger context. And whether or not that's, an assault or abuse or, the degrading, messaging of unattainable beauty standards, it all happens within, this layered context. And because harm happens in relationship, healing also needs to happen in relationship. And we talked about in episode 1, relationship is the intervention. As individuals, an interruption of dignity is anything that comes for your self-worth, right? Any assault on your self-worth. An interruption of agency can be very direct, right? Like incarceration or many of the activities and steps that lead up to it. Like there is no more fundamental interruption of somebody's agency than incarcerating them, right? Like you might still have some bits of agency that you carry in a carceral setting, but virtually every decision about how you conduct your day is being influenced by the carceral state that has put you there. We can also talk about like the felt sense of belonging that might be eroded by being like the black sheep in the family, or just those little subtle messages that tell you you don't belong, right? Like those are the things that like any one individual, a lot of us could withstand, or even several of them we could withstand. But when they are cumulative over time, eventually people just really start to internalize and believe that they're not worthy of love and belonging and the care and protection of the collective.
I have a whole shelf or section of my bookshelf that is just books on belonging. And one of them is, I think it's Jeffrey Cohen's book, and he studies belonging uncertainty, and that belonging uncertainty, even if it's not, oh, I know that I'm being excluded, I know that I'm being othered, but like, I'm not sure if I belong, right, is just as disruptive to our nervous system. It's just as much of a threat to our like herd animal sense as actively kind of not belonging, and has really intense impacts on people's like cognitive function and their creativity. It's wild. Check it out. Put it in the show notes. We talk about identities that get reclaimed as a way to kind of push back against this othering or this uncertainty around belonging. We actually create belonging amongst ourselves and we reclaim identities that may have been kind of black sheeped in the past. And so one of the identities that I often claim is about being a blurred. And I think that the Venn diagram of blackness and nerddom was very far apart for a long time and had to be like real deeply underground. But the reality is, right, like it's not that like black folks can't be nerds and nerds can't be black. And the creation of that identity actually created more space for more folks who are in both of those little Venn diagram camps that come together. I took my daughter to our first Blurred Fest in New Orleans last spring, and she like did her whole little cosplay thing. It was amazing. And that was not a thing that was available to me as a kid, right? Like there was no there were no cons where like black folks were really the center. And I think it's really potent and really powerful for folks to establish a sense of belonging with other people who have been excluded or othered, right? That's one of the ways that we actually get to heal collectively and individually. I think all of these ways, we talk about kind of organizing, we talk about, I think about cultural organizing a lot, and all of these ways that we have of creating belonging and claiming identities and reclaiming identities are about reclaiming connection. They're about reestablishing wholeness. It's about finding a new herd. You're like, oh, this is my herd, right? I do long for a day when we get to be like a whole humanity herd, and I'm actively working us toward that direction. And until then, we get to have lots of little herds that help us feel a sense of, oh, I'm like safe enough here. I belong enough here. And so obviously, individuals exist, right, in a collective context. And so when we're talking about collective interruptions, it's a little bit less about kind of who is impacted and more about who is targeted, right? So if we want to make that distinction, one of the examples is, Japanese internment during World War II, right? It was an interruption of collective belonging, and I would argue agency and dignity and also safety for Japanese folks or even Japanese seeming people in the United States during that time. And there are lots of folks who have done really incredible work on this. My kind of favorite recently is George Takei's book. He's got this amazing graphic novel they called Us Enemy. And it's just got this deeply relatable and really moving representation and rendering of like what internment was and what that impact was for families who are experiencing that. I live in Louisiana, so it is a state that has been plagued by, voter disenfranchisement in the last couple of years. We just got a second majority Black district in the state with the argument that about a third of the people in the state are Black people, and so we should have about a third of those congressional representation. It was fought over and over and over again for, I don't know, about a year and a half in various kind of court places, but it passed and it's happening. And, that is a collective targeting of Black people's agency that is slowly being restored. And yet at the same time, I live in Louisiana, which is also a state that has banned abortion, right? And so that sense of agency and like the agency that folks with wombs have over their own bodies is being assaulted actively right now by the state, right? Like that's happening. That is a targeting of women, of femme folks, of people who have wombs, of people who can have children. Like that is really specific. And it is happening again by the state. There are individual actors, but it is a collective targeting. It's a collective trauma that isn't being restored right now, even though lots of folks are fighting it and fighting for reproductive justice. But right now, that's not what's happening.
As a female-bodied person, I feel a pervasive, chronic, collective attack from the assault on reproductive rights that's happened. Honestly, pinpointing where this started, I think, is a little bit of a slippery slope that we don't need to get into. And unfortunately, this is a good example of interruption across multiple layers. But every time I personally, in my own Leslie Biner body brain, hear that another state has essentially outlawed abortion, my gut drops. Like my heart, I feel it in my body. And every time I hear a story about a woman bleeding to death in a hospital parking lot, like I have a physiological stress response. It's it's not just an idea. It's not just like a bit of news I heard that is bad. Like it literally stresses out my body
Hmm.
every time I hear one of those stories. And this is what makes it a collective trauma, right? Like that's the interruption. And the trauma response is that you hear something in witness of someone else's trauma and it physically, physiologically, emotionally impacts you. There are a number of examples of erosions of safety agency, dignity, and belonging in the reproductive rights kind of issue that we've talked about. But I would also offer that the act of overturning Roe v. Wade was a cleaving, right? Or maybe an explosion of those fundamentals. So if you think about like at an individual level, thinking about what a cleaving or explosion feels like, might make more sense. But what does it feel like at a collective or systemic level? It feels like all of us opening our newsfeed and learning that Roe v. Wade was no longer the rule of the land. And knowing that there were at least a dozen states that were like ready, queued up, and preparing to take away bodily autonomy and healthcare that people need. It has that before and after quality that is really inherent to trauma. Lots of people talk about trauma as the indelible mark or
Hmm.
having a
Hmm.
before and after. And we all just like in our colloquial everyday language are talk in terms of like before and after Dobbs. Like we talk about that cleaving of our rights, of our bodily autonomy in those same terms of trauma. And we can repair it, fix it back up again, but it won't ever take the moment away that in 2022, I think is when Dobbs happened, that a bunch of people got together and thought it was okay to deny people abortion access and healthcare, which in and of itself should tell us where our body politic and our politics are, that could even happen, right? So even if we restore abortion rights, we still have that larger kind of systemic cultural issues to look at that were what created the conditions under which Roe v. Wade would have been overturned in the first place.
I learned during the pandemic that my family is really good at road trips, which I did not know beforehand and would not have guessed. And we rely heavily on the interstate system. And because I'm me and my kids were talking about whether we were on the interstate or the intrastate and what's the difference, and I was like, well, let me tell you, this system was set up by a general so that we could move materiel, right? So we could move kind of military weapons and personnel quickly from one place to another in these kind of major cities or major Air Force and Army bases. When they were building that, the what do they call it? Negative externality of it was that they tended to drive them through cities. And when they drove them through cities, they drove them through the parts of the city where the property values were lower. And why were the property values lower? The property values were lower because all the black people lived there. So I won't go all the way into redlining and that entire history, but I will say that when we talk about systemic harms, right? So like redlining happened, right? And so it kept Black people in a concentrated place. It kept the property values of those areas low so that when it was time to do eminent domain and be like, we're buying this all up, or we're just forcing you out and just taking it so we can drive a highway through here so we can more quickly get guns and bombs and soldiers from one place to another, y'all are just on your own, right? And so it happened in the Treme in New Orleans. It happened in Overtown in Miami. It happened in the Fillmore in the Bay Area. Like you can look around the country and find where that happened. And every time it was through these like historically Black neighborhoods that were vibrant communities. So I don't think that these things are disconnected. And I think the last thing that I'll say about it, just in terms of like how it was a severe interruption of belonging, a severe interruption of agency, is that it left these scars, right? Like in communities that haven't recovered, right? Like you can't build a house on top of a highway. That's not how that works, right? So the ability to kind of reconnect those communities was forever changed.
Traumatic interruptions are really what perpetuate trauma at both the genetic level, which is a field we can talk about as epigenetics, and at the behavioral level. We'll get a little bit more into some of this in episode 4, but just as a sort of an example, right? Again, we're not trying to like re-traumatize people too much here today, but trauma is passed down behaviorally in the behaviors in families, right? So if your response to stress is to yell at the next person who in your family who has less power than you, right? If you're the head of household, yelling at the other person or yelling at the kids or the kids yelling at the dog or whatever it is, if that's how you were raised and it was modeled to you to handle stress or discomfort, then that is what you will pass down to the next generation unless you interrupt and restore that in your generation so that you're not passing it on. The tricky thing about the intergenerational layer is that it's really about modes of transmission. It's about how trauma is passed down from one generation to the next. So in my family, which we had a lot of resiliency and a lot of love, right? There was a lot of safety, agency, dignity in the buckets there. And there wasn't a lot of yelling, but if my mom got stressed or overwhelmed, she would storm out into the garage and not talk to anybody for a day or two. And so sure enough, I get towards adulthood and, when I get stressed out in a relationship, the first thing I will do is give people the silent treatment, right? It's not something I sat around and thought, how do I want to act when I'm stressed out? It is just an innate behavior that was what was modeled for me. And so that is what I pick up until I choose proactively to do something different. At the genetic level, we know that trauma and stressful conditions can turn on your genetic stress markers. And those genetic stress markers then kind of predispose or preclude people to have a higher stress response. And then that means that your body is, soaked in stress chemicals, cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, more of the time, leading to what we think now is a lot of inflammation. That's what leads to all of these chronic health issues, right? Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension. And so we know that there's a connection between trauma and stress and negative health outcomes. But those modes of transmission, right, are really still, we're only beginning to really understand them now.
We should talk about ACEs at some point. There was this
Yeah.
whole study around adverse childhood experiences. It was actually what made me go back to school. So I was at a talk with Dr. Bob Anda, who was one of the original investigators on the ACEs study. And he was giving a talk. And the adverse childhood experiences are these 8 experiences that if you have them, you have these worse health outcomes, higher morbidity and mortality rates, right? So worse health outcomes much later in life. And the way that the study worked is that they rounded up 17,000 people from the Kaiser Permanente health system, an overwhelmingly white demographic in California. And they asked them all these questions about their lives, but particularly in that kind of early childhood area. And what they found was really incredible, like you were saying, Leslie, later term negative health outcomes based on these childhood experiences. And they were things like, divorce, child abuse, neglect,
Addiction.
I don't remember the other 4.
Mental health issues.
Awesome. You got them all?
Probably not.
And
incarceration.
Put it in the show notes. And the one that I remember so clearly, right, is that the adverse childhood experiences were so intense, right, were so disruptive to people's normal functioning that you were 25 times more likely to be an intravenous drug user in your adulthood if you had 4 or more, right? And it was, and that's a very small, tiny bit of the population. Not a lot of folks are shooting up, but the likelihood was so much higher if you had had an abundance of these adverse childhood experiences. And so when I think about intergenerational trauma, I think that's one of the places that I often go to is, yes, what's the kind of stress soup that you're being cooked in as your brain is developing in those kind of 0 to 5 years or 0 to 8 years? And also, how long a tail that has over the course of your life. I went to a talk. I was like, hey, yo, I'd like to see this data. Can I get this data? And he was like, are you a grad student? And I was like, no. But if I was, could I get that data? And he was like, yes. And I went back to grad school.
And that's how Teddy and I met.
When I thought I was going to be a researcher.
All those years ago. Oh, you thought you were going to be a researcher?
I sure did. I was wrong.
That's pretty adorable.
Yes. I was very wrong.
He's not a researcher now.
Yeah. Apparently, I just wanted to do theory building. I didn't actually want to do research.
It just took us stumbling onto a theory to realize we had to build it.
Stumbling onto no theory.
Okay, so we have one more layer to talk about here, and that's historical trauma.
Yeah, so I'll go back to the example of Japanese internment, in part because it's relatively kind of recent in the imagination, and in part because it was actually acknowledged as a harm. So functionally, internment operated as an historical trauma in that it had an impact on a collective body that persisted over time, right? And there was a societal remedy, right? So when Leslie talks about like the healing has to happen at the level of harm, it wasn't that individuals needed to experience some level of healing, though some did. It was that at the level of the harm, right? So, like at the societal level, there had to be a remedy. And so there was reparation. Again, not complete, not perfect, but known and named and attempted. And I think that not that it fixes everything, but that gesture toward or that movement toward wholeness, right? That's where that is. That's where that lives. And it was made at the same level as the harm. So does it mean that it was sufficient? Not necessarily. Does it mean that everyone who suffered or experienced that individually or collectively was made whole? Like, no. But do I think it brought the collective body closer to wholeness? Like, I actually do. Right. And I think that right now, or maybe this was 2 years ago, there was a plan, I think in the infrastructure bill, to tear down some of these highways that they
Yeah.
drove through these black
Hmm.
neighborhoods. Right. And I remember hearing it and being so excited. I was like, oh, yes, tear down I-10, like let Claiborne be Claiborne. Right. It has not happened yet. But there were plans and there were dreams and there were people who were saying, who were longing for something that had been and to reconnect with that. And so, when we talk about like wellness and wholeness, it's there. Like it wants to come forward, it wants to come forth. And often, like we just have to let it. And at the collective level or at the societal level, at these, in these historical trauma moments, I think we can kind of get caught up in what is and stop being able to kind of imagine what could be, but it's there, even if it's buried, even if it's constrained, even if our access to our wholeness or wellness is compromised, like it's there.
And there aren't like a million examples of restoration at the cultural historical level that we can just rattle off here. There's a couple of big ones, right? The acknowledgement and kind of a attempts at atonement after the internment of Japanese people in World War II that Teddy talked about. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee
Hmm.
in South Africa that addressed the long and devastating legacy of apartheid. The Nuremberg trials after World War II, right? These moments where a culture, society gets together and says, we are going to bear witness,
Hmm.
right? We are going to have an accounting. We are going to create a record. And then we're going to figure out what steps we can take so that this does not happen again. And if you look at kind of the arc of things like truth and reconciliation committees or international criminal court tribunals, and there's a tribunal after the genocide in Rwanda, there's always these elements, right, of recording, of bearing witness, and of, what can we learn from this, right? But we have to imagine them into being. The fact that there is so few examples to draw on is noteworthy, right? There's a zillion different wars in human history we can talk about, but there's not as many truth and reconciliation processes that we can talk about after those wars. There's treaties, but, it's not quite the same thing. So it's worth noting again here towards the end as we wrap up that this episode 3, this statement 3 about trauma interrupts is kind of the messy middle of all of this. And we've been a little deep in what trauma is. And so we'll talk about how these interruptions overwhelm us in the next episode 4. And then finally we will get to pathways to healing. But just hold this piece of trauma interrupts and healing restores kind of as two parts of the whole. Okay, so as we wrap up this episode today, as we've been doing here on the pod, we've got a little bit of integration practice you can think about as you go back into your world today. And then Teddy will close with a closing practice. So our homework offering for today is to think about the preservation and interruption of the fundamentals that's happened to you in some place you call home, right? So that might be where you're currently living. That might be the community, the neighborhood you grew up in. That might be the house you grew up in. It might be some place that isn't where you live regularly, but you still consider home. Think about this place. Think about its history. Think about the built environment. Does it have a history of redlining? Who decided what got built? How it got built? Who does it serve? Did we pave over pools? Did we build highways through existing, thriving communities? Did we make sure that everybody had equitable access to good education and that people were protected from the impacts of environmental racism in industry? I did my undergraduate work in the Bay Area at an amazing, amazing little school called the California Institute of Integral Studies, because apparently I was into integration in the way back days. But one of the very cool things that we did in that program was we took a field trip to Richmond, California, and we just did like a little walking tour, and we really looked at the built environment, and we really kind of looked at who built it, how is it built, who does it serve, what is the history of this place? And it literally changed how I look at built environments when I drive through them, right? I'm really asking some different critical questions about the spaces around us and what they contain and who they serve and what their purpose is.
And you might even want to think about who belongs there, who is safe there, who has agency there, who has dignity there.
Spend some time, maybe thinking on that and thinking about how any interruptions in that place of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging have shaped or formed or created that place that you are thinking about as home.
So today the offering for our closing practice is an affirmation practice. And I want to give you all a quick primer on affirmations. So again, if we were in the room, right, I would have my little whiteboard and I'd be like, write out all my definitions. But for now, just know this, right, that affirmations are different from acknowledgements or appreciations or admirations, and that their focus is on the person or entity that is being affirmed and what that person or entity cares about. So when you're standing in the mirror and you are speaking affirmations to yourself, right, it is a reflection, right, of your own commitments, beliefs, values, qualities, things that you care about. The video that my friend Hart sent me of the girl jumping around saying, I could be anything. I could be a shark, right? Like that is her affirmation, and I love it. Listening to the Snoop Dogg affirmations that my kids have been singing, which I also love. But all those things are external reflection of an internal commitment or an internal possibility, right? So you can speak that affirmation to yourself. You can speak it in a mirror. Bonus points if you speak it to someone that you trust or ask them to affirm you and something that you care about and practice being affirmed by them.
That's the hard part. Letting people affirm you. I mean, I don't know what everyone else's experience is, but we live in a culture that has some real dignity deficits. And I think one of the impacts of that is that hearing, meaningful affirmations of ourselves can be difficult. So that's the bonus level here that you can unlock with today's closing practice.
Great. So Leslie, I would like to affirm your devotion, your commitment to doing the damn thing in so many areas of your life. Yes, in this podcasting world, but also in your home world and in your relationships, like the commitment to practice and the commitment to doing the thing. I see it all the time, and it looks good on you.
Thanks, Teddy. And so I wasn't prepared to do that, Teddy. I wasn't prepared. I'm reading this going, what the hell is this supposed to say? Well, thank you, Teddy. I will do my best to internalize that today and appreciate the warm ways in which you bear witness to all of the things I do in the world, because I do you. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. And more to come on episode 4.
That was
Shout
perfect.
out to our producer, Sylvia, our amazing editor. Sorry, I don't know how to do this part.
Sorry.
Sylvia's amazing.
It's closing. Nope, you're good.
Okay.
I feel great about that.
Okay, well, thanks, y'all.
Peace.
We're getting so good at this. We're like, this is like all of a sudden we're professionals.
That is a statement.